Hello, everyone. Can everybody hear me? Sure sounds like it. I'm David Musser. I am going to be your presenter today for session number 20, Return of Title IV Resources and Q&A. Unfortunately, my co-presenter, Greg Martin of the Office of Post-Secondary Education, was not able to join me. He has a conflict. He's over in another session speaking about the distance education negotiated rulemaking rules. So it's just me, and I know that we have a very big room, and you guys are spending your lunch with me talking about Return of Title IV, so I very much appreciate that. But if I could ask if anyone is willing to, who are sitting way in the back, if you want to come up. It's really hard to see everybody in the room, and this session is mostly a Q&A session. If you don't feel like it, I know how it is. I like to sit in the back too. But my name, as I said, is David Musser. I work for the Federal Student Aid with the Policy Liaison and Implementation Group. I have worked there for about 6 years. Prior to that, I was a program reviewer in the Chicago Regional Office. And prior to that, I was an assistant director at Northwestern University's undergraduate aid office. So one of my areas of expertise is the Return of Title IV funds process. And so what I'm going to do today, it's a little bit of a different kind of presentation than what we've done in the past. Last year, we tried something different. We had office hours for Return of Title IV. What we found is that a lot of questions that are related to Return of Title IV are very specific. Often they are about a specific student, a specific situation, a specific set of factors that we have a hard time talking about in our presentations. So we had a great hour of office hours last year, but we didn't get to everybody. So this year we decided that we would try something new, and we are going to have this presentation in order to take questions from you as a group. If we run out of questions, if folks don't have any more questions, then I'm also going to make myself available for the remainder of the time. But this is really your opportunity to ask me questions about Return of Title IV funds. And hopefully get a good answer. And if I can't, I'll take your information and we can talk later on. So our agenda today is pretty simple. We're going to talk about the basic principles of the Return of Title IV funds process. Then we're going to talk about the nuts and bolts of the Return of Title IV calculation, sort of how each step of the calculation works, and we're going to walk through the worksheet. Then I'm going to point you to some of the best resources that the department has on Return of Title IV funds. If you have additional questions, places that you want to go when stuff comes up in your office that you're not familiar with or you have an unanswered question. And then finally, we're going to open it up for questions and answers, and hopefully we'll have about 45 minutes or maybe around 30 minutes for that Q&A time. But that's the goal. All right, so the very basic principles of Return of Title IV. First, Congress created the Return of Title IV process in the 1998 reauthorization of the Higher Education Act. Prior to that, there was a return methodology that had to do with an institution's tuition refund system. Congress did away with that and created the Return of Title IV process in order to replace that. And there's a very, very basic idea, sort of philosophical premise behind the Return of Title IV funds process. Return of Title IV funds are awarded to a student with the assumption that the student's going to attend for the entire period for which the funds were awarded. So that sounds a little complicated, but think of it this way. You give a Pell Grant disbursement to a student for a semester, let's say a fall semester. The expectation from the government's perspective is that the student's going to attend the entire fall semester because that's what the aid was intended to cover. However, when a student ceases attendance planned to that prior date, the student may not be eligible for the full amount of the aid that he or she received. And that is where the Return of Title IV funds process comes in. The Return of Title IV funds process, which I will call R2T4 to make this a little easier on all of us, is designed to determine how much of the aid for the period the student earned. Now, the student earns Title IV aid in an amount equal to the amount of attendance in a period. And that works two different ways for two different types of programs. So in a credit hour program, the percentage of how much aid a student earns is equal to the percentage that the student completed. As of the withdrawal date, in a clock hour program, it's essentially the same, but there's a different way to calculate how much the student has earned in each type of program. So once you know how much the student has earned, you have to compare that to how much you actually dispersed. If the school dispersed more aid than the student earned, then the school is probably going to have to make a return of some of that aid to the department. If a school has dispersed less aid than a student has earned, then a post-withdrawal disbursement will be calculated and must be offered to the student or parent. So, and here's a really important factor. If a student completes more than 60% of a payment period or period of enrollment, the student has earned 100% of his or her aid for the period. Now, that's not 60%, that's 60.01%, so it has to be more than 60%. If the student earns 60%, it's 60%, but any more than that, the student is treated as having earned all of his or her funds of the period. And this is the factor I was mentioning before, the next bullet. Institutional and tuition refund policies have no effect on the R2T4 process itself. The tuition refund process that you run whenever a student leaves, and it's based on your own institution or maybe state or accrediting agency's requirements, that happens separate from the Return of Title IV process. Then, once both the institutional refund process and the Return of Title IV process have run and both are complete, then you may have an impact because you will have to see whether there's a credit balance remaining, you'll have to determine how much money the student may owe you, but these two things happen independently of one another. And the last major principle here is that we expect schools to use the best information that they have in order to determine a student's withdrawal date. That's a general expectation that the department has of all institutions. All right, so now I want to walk through the actual calculation, and I'm going to take you through each section of the worksheet and kind of just give you a sense of how the calculation is structured, how it works. As I go through this, it's probably going to seem a little bit complicated, but I have to tell you, most of the complication comes in with regard to how you come up with these numbers. It's one of those garbage in, garbage out kind of situations. Once you determine how much aid the student is eligible for and how much they've attended, it's easy. The calculation practically runs itself. But figuring out those numbers is where all the complication in the Return of Title IV funds process comes in. So step one, the institution determines the net amounts of aid that the student is eligible for at the time of the withdrawal. And when I say net amounts, I'm really talking about loans, subtracting out the loan fees. So you're looking at the actual amount that hit the student's account for these disbursement amounts. And what you're trying to figure out in this step is both the amount of aid that the student was dispersed and the amount of aid that the student could have been dispersed and was eligible to receive during that period. Now, for aid that was dispersed, it's usually pretty straightforward. If the student was eligible for the aid and you dispersed it, well, then you have the numbers. You just look at their account card, their ledger card, and indicate how much they received. But if the aid could have been dispersed, that's a determination that's often a little bit harder to make, and it's based on a number of different factors that the department has set out about when a student could have been dispersed a type of aid. It's actually based on another set of regulations that we refer to as the late disbursement regulations, but I'll give you an example. For Pell Grant purposes, a student could have been dispersed a Pell Grant if the student had an ICER, if you have received an ICER or the student has received a SAR with an official EFC. Ultimately, you'll have to do verification or whatever else needs to be done in order to make that disbursement, but that is the factor that determines whether the student could have been dispersed the aid. On the other hand, for a direct loan, the loan actually has to be originated before you can consider aid that could have been dispersed for the period. And of course, you have to have the student actually sign the NPN before you make the disbursement, et cetera. But that's a complicated set of issues, and it's something that you should consider whenever you're doing one of these calculations. I've seen cases in the program review setting where schools have put all the amounts that were dispersed, but they didn't spend much time thinking about which aid could have been dispersed. There were loans that had been originated that are just sitting out there. And the aid that could have been dispersed is one of the most important factors in these calculations because it can reduce the amount that either A, you, the institution, have to return, or B, it could actually lead to a post-withdrawal disbursement to a student if you haven't dispersed all of the student's funds. So, as I mentioned before, there are two different types of methods to determine how much aid a student has earned for a period, one for credit hour programs and one for clock hour programs. In the credit hour version of the program, you have the numerator, which is the number of days the student attended during the period, generally a payment period, but it could be a period of enrollment, your academic year. And the denominator is the total number of days in the period. So for example, if you have 90 days in your semester, that would be your denominator. And then if the student attended 12 days, then that's your numerator. Now there are some other complicating factors. We ask that you exclude from both the numerator and the denominator any scheduled breaks of at least 5 consecutive days or more. And we get a lot of questions about this because what does that mean exactly? What it really means is if you have a vacation and that vacation is five or more days, that's easy. Then in that case, you would exclude that period. But if you have a vacation and it butts up against a weekend, and the weekend is not a period where you offer any classes, then you'll combine the vacation days and the weekend days, and if it equals 5 or more, then that will be something that you exclude. If it's less than 5, then you won't exclude those days. They'll just be part of the days that are included in your denominator. So clock hour programs work in a very similar way. The institution calculates the amount that the student earned with the numerator of the hours the student was scheduled to complete at the time of the withdrawal, and the denominator is the total hours in the period. So it's fairly straightforward. The scheduled hours simply accrue based on the institution's schedule for the student. So you'll have an established schedule. Generally, it's something that's approved by your accrediting agency or complies with your accrediting agency's requirements. And you'll just add the number of hours the student was scheduled to attend each day, again, regardless of the amount the student actually attended, and then on the withdrawal date, you'll stop adding those up. And that's how you determine the numerator for a clock hour calculation. So once you've determined the percentage of the period that the student completed, essentially you just apply that percentage to the total amount of aid, so both aid that was dispersed and aid that could have been dispersed, and that gives you the total amount of Title IV aid that the student that earned for the payment period. So that's obviously a very important figure. This number is going to determine potentially how much you, the school, have to return or how much a student receives in a post-withdrawal disbursement. Now, if a return is required, so if you find that you've dispersed more than the student has earned, then you need to go to step 5, which is where you determine how much you, the institution, are responsible for returning. And this process essentially it's designed to ensure that you don't end up returning more than you actually charge the student. The department is attempting to find a way to limit the amount that you're responsible for if you haven't actually charged the student very much and the student received a lot of that aid, for example, as a credit balance. But essentially what you do is you take the amount that the student earned, and that's that box H there, the little purple square, and you subtract that from 100% and you get the amount the student did not earn. Then you have all of the institutional charges for the period. So institutional charges being tuition and fees, room and board if you contract the student for room and board, and you also are responsible for the room and board. So you take those institutional charges, you multiply it by the amount the student did not earn, and then you get the amount that the school is responsible for, and that's box O down there at the bottom. So that box O is the maximum amount that you, the school, will be required to return for this student. It might be lower than that if the amount that the student did not earn if the amount of unearned aid is lower, but that's the maximum that you'll ever be required to return. So once you figure out the amount that you're required to return, then you actually have to make the returns. You have to make the returns in a statutorily determined order, and you can see that order on the screen. It starts with unsubsidized direct loan funds, it goes down through subsidized direct loan funds. The Perkins loan this is an old slide actually, the Perkins loan won't be on there in the current worksheet. And then both your grad and parent plus loans, and then you'll start returning grant funds once you've exhausted all of the students' loan funds, starting with Pell, going to FSA and TEACH, and finally the Iraq-Afghanistan service grant. So once you've determined the amount that the institution is required to return, whatever is left over is the student's responsibility. And really there's only 2 different options for how the student has to deal with those amounts. If the student's responsibility is comprised of loan funds, no further action needs to be taken. You simply have to finish the worksheet, make your returns that you were required to return, and then the student will return the remainder of those funds through the normal process of repaying the loan in accordance with the terms of the master promissory note. However, if the amount that's left over is Title IV grant funds, then there's just another few steps that you have to go through, and it's a little bit more complicated. But basically what the department does here is we apply a protection so that the student is not required to return very much of his or her grant funds. Essentially, if the amount of the overpayment is greater than 50% of the total grant assistance dispersed for the period, then the student is going to be responsible for paying back that grant overpayment. And essentially, at that point, you'll have to either find a way to get the student in a repayment plan with you, the institution. He or she can make a lump sum repayment, or you can refer the overpayment to the department. But the student has essentially 45 days to take one of those steps, and after the 45th day, you'll have to report the overpayment to NSLDS, and the student will need to keep working to pay that down and won't be Title IV eligible until he or she completes that process. Now, I should mention that that's a rare instance. If any of you have actually encountered that, it may be a little bit of a surprise to you because it happens fairly rarely, but it does happen, especially in institutions that have very low tuition, because that's the circumstance where the school is not required to return very much, and the student ends up being responsible for more of the Title IV aid that he or she received during the period. All right, so I want to refer you to some of the past presentations that we've done. That's all for my portion of the presentation. So we've got the 2018 FSA conference. We had an essential concepts presentation. That one's really long. It has an awful lot of information in it. We tried to cover all of our bases. If I remember, we barely made it through that presentation. We had so much to talk about. The 2017 FSA conference, we had 2 different presentations, basic principles and advanced concepts. I do strongly recommend taking a look at both of those and just seeing if anything applies to you. We tried to cover a lot of ground with both of those again, but the advanced concepts deal with some things that don't come up in most trainings and in most situations regarding return of Title IV, including a lot of information about modular programs, which we have gotten a lot of questions about, and we know that some schools are still struggling with. Even though we've been doing that for around 8 years, we do recognize that modular programs add a lot of complications. So that presentation has a lot of information about how modular programs will work with return of Title IV funds. And also, FSA Coach has a module for managing student withdrawals, a lot of great training and a lot of great information there. I highly recommend you take a look at that. I'm not going to go through all of these, but here's all of the guidance. If you download this presentation on our website at fsaconferences.ed.gov, you can actually click on, these are all links. You can click on each of these and it'll take you directly to the resource itself. But this is basically a list of nearly all of the official guidance and law and legal language that the department has on return of Title IV funds. I even linked to the Code of Federal Regulations website that the department maintains, 34 CFR 668.22. That's the actual wording of the regulations. And I will say that if you ever find yourself in dire straits with an RJT4 situation, you can't figure out what to do, I would recommend going to that regulatory citation, seeing what the words say to you and whether they make sense. If you want to dig even further, you can look at the Federal Register notices. Each of those Federal Register notices are the department provided some of its rationale in the preamble to those notices about why it created the rules, what it had in mind, and then it also responds to questions from the public in the final rules. So those are often really, really helpful and things that you can work with if you have questions about what the department's looking for you to do. And with that, I'm going to wrap up my portion, and I'm going to open it up for questions. We still have about an hour left to go, so we have plenty of time. So we have 3 mics, 1, 2, and 3. And I would just ask that if you guys have questions, just come on up and stand in line at the microphones, and then we will go through them. All right. Number 2.
Okay, it's my lucky number. Okay, I have two questions.
Sure.
My first question is, if a student's second loan disbursement came in after their LDA and before their DOD, they were still a student,
Okay.
are we required to return those loans in full because we're not required? We can't keep that because we can't technically have inadvertent or a post-withdrawal disbursement.
So generally, the answer to that is you're correct. When a disbursement is made between the student's withdrawal date and the date of determination, so it happens, sometimes does happen, the student drops out on Monday, you make the disbursement on Wednesday, you find out that they dropped out on Friday. That is what we call an inadvertent overpayment, and in those cases, we consider those funds to be ineligible. They don't get, you're not able to actually include them as aid that was dispersed in the calculation, and in general, you'll have to return them. But you don't return them in full, and this is the really complicated part about inadvertent overpayments. Because what you'll do is you'll perform the R2T4 calculation and you'll include the inadvertent overpayment as aid that could have been dispersed, because I'm assuming they met all the qualifications for that since you ended up making the disbursement. And then once the calculation is complete, you're going to have to look at what the calculation says, what should have been the return, and the net amount that you actually dispersed, and return it down to net those things out. So it ends up being a little bit complicated because you have to figure out what the student should have gotten, and you don't want to return the whole loan and then pay back a little bit as post-withdrawal disbursement, et cetera. So that's what I would recommend if that comes up.
But does that make a difference if it's the student's second loan disbursement? Because isn't there a rule if...
So if it's the second loan disbursement, then you ultimately can't make the disbursement.
If it was already dispersed, so we have to return it in full?
So you would end up including it as, and I don't know if it's going to affect the situation, as aid that could have been dispersed, but you won't actually be able to make it as a post-withdrawal disbursement. So it might impact the amount of grant aid the student has if that's a factor.
If no grant, then
okay. So then you'll end up returning the entire amount.
And don't get to keep
it. Yep.
Okay.
That's right.
Okay, and then my second question has to do with the 14-day DOD.
Okay.
So we're a standard term quarter base. Our terms are 12-week in length. So if we have a 1-week break in between the quarters, and we have a student that successfully completes, let's say, our fall quarter, and then there's a week break, and then our winter term starts, and the student never attends.
Okay.
Does the 14-day start from the beginning of the winter term, or would it start from the student's last day?
Well, let me step back for a second. So is your institution required to take attendance?
Yes.
You are?
Yes.
And do you complete return of Title IV calculations on a payment period basis or
Yes.
a period of enrollment basis?
Payment period.
Payment period basis. Okay. So your student, you said you completed the prior payment period?
Yes, successfully completed, let's say, the fall term, and then there's a week break before the winter term starts. Student never enters the winter term. Can we start the 14, would the DOD be from, like, let's say, January 14th, or do we have to take it from the student's LDA, even though there was no classes scheduled for that week?
So in that situation, maybe I'm missing something, but it doesn't sound like the student withdrew or would be subject to the return of Title IV process, because if you're performing the calculation on a payment period basis and the student completed the payment period, then the student they completed. They were eligible for all of their aid, and you don't have to do anything for that period. Now, for the next period, if you've determined the student did not attend at all, then obviously the student's not eligible for any aid in that period, but there's no date of determination because there's no return of Title IV process to pursue in that case.
Okay.
So if you have a completer, that's the best case scenario.
Okay.
If you've got a passing grade or something like that, and then you don't have to actually do the R2T4 process.
So if it's just an internal where we put the DOD, it doesn't matter if, we still have to put a DOD whether we do an R2T4 or not. So.
Well, again, if the student completed, then they're not a withdrawal, and they don't actually, you don't have to do any kind of a date of determination. If you have your system in your records, if you want to just say, we know the student is no longer attending as of this date, you can certainly do that. Just don't confuse that with the return of Title IV process, because that won't apply. And by the way, the 14 days definitely does apply to you, and you would want to have that as a general requirement. But in case cases where the student completes, you just don't, you wouldn't want to confuse your auditor, for example, by indicating that you should have done a calculation, but you didn't, but here's the number of days that you took to complete it. So I would recommend trying to differentiate those things in your system somehow, or just make a note that this is a completer.
Okay, thank you.
Sure. Over here at 3.
I think I have 3 questions.
3, all right.
Date of determination for an institution who is not required to take attendance.
Okay.
We identify earned fail grades based on a last date of attendance that faculty is required to post when they post the F grade.
Okay.
So that's how we figure out who the unofficial
Got it.
withdrawals are. What is the time that, number one, I need to determine that the student is an unofficial withdrawal?
Mm-hmm.
And how much time do I have from that point in time to return the money?
Okay. So if you're not required to take attendance, then you must make a determination about whether the student withdrew within 30 days of the end of the period. So if you, I'm assuming you do the
We're
calculation.
a semester school, yes.
Semester,
so-
okay. So by the way, if you are a semester school, if you use standard terms, you have to do it on the payment period basis, so that you don't have a choice. But so you do it on a payment period basis. You'll have 30 days from the end of your term to determine that the student withdrew, and then you'll have 45 days from the date that you make that determination to actually return the funds. So it depends on when you make the determination as to when that 45-day clock starts.
Okay, we're good, thanks. Faculty are required to post grades within, I think, 8 days from
Okay.
the last date.
That
so
sounds like it
we
would
get
work,
on it
yeah.
right away. Okay,
Okay.
thank you. Second question has
2.
to do with the spring break.
Okay?
We don't have a break in the fall, so there's no break,
Okay.
no more than 5 days. We just have Thanksgiving, so we're good. But in the spring, we do have a spring break. We do offer 2 classes on Saturday.
Okay.
And the last day of classes would be the Saturday before.
Okay.
How many days is the spring break?
So it's 1 full week, at that, and the Saturday before you have classes. So Sunday you don't have classes, 5 days where you don't have classes, and then Saturday you have classes again.
No.
The next Saturday you don't, so that one's canceled, right?
So let's say Saturday is the last day of classes, and then we don't offer classes again until the following Monday.
Monday. So then that's 8. So it's the Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday. That's 8. So that'll be your scheduled break would be 8 days, and you would exclude 8 days from the numerator and denominator of the calculation. And that's because you're not offering classes on those days, and they are combined with the number of days in the actual vacation period.
And there's no wiggle room on that at all.
No.
We never offer classes on Sunday. Everybody comes back on Monday, but we have to count it.
You still have to exclude it. Yeah. It generally that's benefits your students, but yeah, you do have to exclude those days.
Okay. Modules.
Okay, I'm ready.
I saved the best for last.
Okay.
So we have a winter term, which is about 2 weeks.
Okay.
It's part of our spring reporting term.
All right.
Without getting specific, maybe you can just go over when you do an R2T4 for somebody who completes the winter term, does not complete the winter term, comes to the subsequent 15-week term that starts in January. They don't overlap. I would appreciate that, thanks.
Well, I'm going to do my best. It helps to have visual aids, and so I would, my clicker's not helping me with this. I would recommend that you take a look at that 2017 presentation on advanced concepts because it goes into much greater detail than I will right now. So essentially, when you have an intercession, and I think that's what you're describing, that's connected to your other term, and did you say it's connected to fall or spring?
Spring.
Spring. So the intercession is the first one, and then the spring term happens. Essentially, we treat for students who attend just the spring, and are there any modules in the spring alone?
They are, but they overlap. So there's a 15-week semester, and then there's a late start, which is an 11-week semester. They end at the same time.
Okay, so that is going to be complicated in many cases. I can
know.
certainly see that. So what it means is that your intercession is a module, and then the modules in your spring term are considered modules on their own. So I'll give a couple different examples. So first, we have a student who started in the winter module and then is scheduled to attend in the spring. They complete the winter module, but then they don't go to their spring classes. That student is a withdrawal, and the denominator in that calculation will be the winter module, and then any modules the student was scheduled to attend in the spring term. Okay, so that's one situation. Another situation would be a student who attends the winter module, completes it, but had never signed up for any spring classes. That student, when they complete the winter module, is a completer. Don't have to do anything with them. They're done. It's all about what the student was scheduled to attend at the time that they cease attendance. And in this context, cease attendance actually could mean completing the module. So if you have a student who is scheduled for the later classes, completes the module, but doesn't return as intended, that could be a withdrawal. Now you've got other cases. Let's say the student was scheduled to attend in spring and winter. They start the winter. They drop out in the middle of the winter intersession, and they give you written confirmation that they plan to return in the spring. That's not a withdrawal. You don't do anything at that point. Now let's say that student doesn't return. Now it is a withdrawal, and you have to go back and do the calculation. If they do return, then all's well, and you don't have to do anything with that. If they do withdraw at that point, then you'd have to go back and subtract out the period that the student wasn't in attendance in terms of when you calculate the number of days in the numerator, but the number of days in the denominator will be all the days in the period. So that it can work out in a lot of different ways. So I don't want to make it too confusing, but that is essentially how it works. When you look at that presentation, we give you a 3-question system for determining whether a student is withdrawn in those circumstances. Essentially, you'll first look at, are they still attending any other classes when they drop this class? If yes, then you go on to the next step. If they're not attending any other classes, are they scheduled to attend any other classes? And that's the big factor. If on the day that they cease attendance, they're scheduled for future periods, they're withdrawals. If not, then they're not. And so when that happens, it actually becomes really important as to when students drop their classes. Some schools have even gone so far as to say, students, if you're not planning to attend in the next module, you better drop your classes in the week prior to completing the module, because it has a huge impact on their return of Title IV.
Well, I don't hold you personally responsible.
Thankfully, I wasn't around when we made those regs, and we are working on changing them, actually.
We would appreciate that.
Okay.
I'm sure I speak for everybody in the room. Thanks.
Thank you. Number 3 again?
Hi, I've got a question about modules as well.
Okay.
So in our summer term, we've got 3 modules, and we've got a student who signed up for just the first module, 6 credits.
Okay.
Completed that module.
All right.
And was never ever scheduled, never planned on attending any of the other modules.
Okay.
And then at the end of the second module, registered for a course for the 3rd module.
All right.
And dropped it the next day, so before that module even started.
Okay.
Does that become an R2T4?
I might have to look at the exact details of the exact dates when the drops and adds happened, because it really, and again, I just want to say it may not be logical in some important ways, but this is how it works. On the day that they completed the second module, were they registered for the next one?
Well, they never took a course in the second module.
Sorry, so which one were they enrolled in?
The first module.
They completed the first module and they
completed
weren't
the
really
first
doing
module.
anything after that?
And nothing after that.
Okay, so at the time that they completed the first module, were they registered for anything else?
No.
And did they ever attend again throughout the period?
No.
Then they are a completer, and that's not a withdrawal.
Okay, so even though that they registered for the course and then dropped it.
That doesn't matter, and it all has to do with were they actually in attendance when that happened? And once they've ceased attendance, if they don't begin attendance later on, then you're only looking at what happened while they were still in attendance. And if they weren't registered when they completed that first module, that's a completer. They're not a withdrawal.
Okay, one other question. If, not the same scenario, but similar, if they had attended also the second module,
Okay.
and subsequently withdrew, and we had to do an R2T4. When you're looking at other aid that could have dispersed, now we've already passed our Pell census date
Okay.
at this point. I don't include that additional Pell, right? Because I would never have awarded it to the student because it was past the date.
That's correct. Whatever you've calculated as your census amount, you can never disperse more than that. Now, it might be less in certain cases if a student ultimately doesn't attend enough to reach the census amount, but you'll never disperse more. So yeah, there's no could have been dispersed if you've already dispersed what the student was eligible for based on your census calculation.
Okay, thank you.
Sure. I think, were you ahead? Okay.
Ahead of me.
One more over here then.
I'm a little short.
No problem.
Okay. So my question is regarding the department's requirements when a student has a credit balance when they withdraw.
Okay.
And an institutional refund policy.
Okay.
So this is the situation. Our refund policy was established before I took this position.
Okay.
And I am trying to make my director and others understand that our institutional refund policy is too strict. It's stricter than it has to be.
Okay.
In the Federal Student Aid Handbook, it discusses what is to be done when a student has a credit balance when they withdraw.
Right.
It's my understanding that that means that that student had the credit balance the day before the actual withdrawal. Okay, so on Tuesday they had a credit balance, they withdraw on Wednesday.
Yep.
The R2T4 calculation has to be done, and we have 14 days from that date to refund any monies.
That's correct, because we expect that you have to do the calculation to know how much the credit balance is ultimately going to be.
Okay, so the person who wrote our policy believed that when a student has a zero balance, or zero credit balance, they withdraw, the R2T4 calculation is done, monies is returned, we use our refund policy, we reduce the cost, what we've charged based on the refund policy. Now the student has a credit balance, and that money has to be refunded to the student within 14 days. It's my understanding that we determine when that refund has to be made, that that's a refund, not a credit balance at the time a student withdraws. And I promised that I would ask this question before we actually make the changes to our refund policy.
I think in this case it might help for me to speak with you offline and look carefully at how the steps of the process work, because I don't want to give you bad information here. You did describe the department's rules about this. Regardless of what, I mean, let's be clear, we always expect you to give a credit balance to a student within 14 days of the credit balance being created on the account. But if the student has a credit balance and then they withdraw, then we give you a pass essentially, and we want you to do the calculation so that you get an accurate amount at the end of the process. And at the end of the process is supposed to be a comparison of how your tuition refund policy has played out, and then how the R2T4 calculation has played out. I don't know what our position would be on cases where your institutional refund policy is dependent on the results of the return of Title IV calculation. So we can.
I may have said that incorrectly. Our refund policy is not based on the R2T4. Our refund policy says that if a student has not completed, if a student has only completed this up to this point, then they're only charged for the number of clock hours that they were scheduled to complete. Okay. Once they reach this point, they've bought the farm and they're responsible for 100%.
For all of it, I see.
So when we make that determination that we are going to only charge them for tuition and fees up to their last day of attendance, they now have monies that is due to be refunded to them. That is based on what our institutional refund policy says, correct? As to when we return that to them, because that's not a credit balance that they had prior to withdrawing.
The only time the feds get involved is when there's a Title IV credit balance, and that's only a situation in which the amount of Title IV aid the student has received for the payment period exceeds the amount of charges for the payment period. So as far as your refund process goes, that can impact whether a student has a Title IV credit balance, but that's not actually the same thing as a Title IV credit balance. The 14-day rule applies to the Title IV credit balance, and only when that applies. But we can talk offline. I'd be glad to.
Do you want me to meet with you afterwards?
Yes, please. I'll have some time afterwards, and we can exchange emails if we need to. Okay, go to number one.
So I've asked this question to a couple of Department of Ed staffers, and I got two different answers that
Uh-oh.
contradicted each other. So I'm going to ask and see if your answer agrees with one of them.
Okay.
Hopefully it's the one I'd like. So we, I understand that we do a calculation based off of attendance, and that attendance is based off of what we fund. So my question is that if we lock a student at 9 credits, but we don't pay for that additional third credit because it's outside their program, we don't pay for courses outside their program, they stay in that one course that we are not paying for, and they finish that course, but they drop from all 9 hours that we funded. Are they considered a student still in attendance, or are they considered somebody that we return on because we're only talking about attendance based off of funding?
They are withdrawal.
Okay.
Yep. And that applies in that situation. It's a fairly rare situation that some, but not all of the students' classes are Title IV eligible. It certainly happens. It happens in that case. It can also happen in a repeating coursework case where they're taking a course that they've already passed twice. But in any of those cases, if a student has a class that is not being included in the Title IV eligibility for that period, essentially not Title IV eligible, and they drop out of all of the Title IV eligible courses, they are considered a withdrawal, and you have to do the calculation based on the amount received for the Title IV eligible courses.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
Hi.
Yep. 3.
Semester-based attendance taken institution, they always take a holiday break. The holiday break is probably 2 weeks, Christmas week, New Year's week.
Okay.
The student's in attendance and then doesn't return. When does a 14-day clock start?
Well, I have to ask all the same questions. Are you your semester program?
Attendance taking.
Standard term, and you are attendance taking.
Yep.
And you do your calculations on a payment
Based
period
on
basis.
a payment period?
So you said a winter break. Is this a break that occurs during the semester?
It does.
Okay. So play out that scenario for me one more time.
So the last date of attendance is obviously just before the break. And then there's a 2-week break.
Okay.
And then the students only come back for like 2 weeks, but the student doesn't return. When does the 14-day clock start?
So this is a tough question, honestly, that we've gotten in a couple of occasions. If you read the handbook, you'll see that we say, except in certain exceptional circumstances, you're generally expected to use the 14-day clock. I would say that in the case that you described, you have no reason to believe that that student has withdrawn until the student is not in attendance following the break. So we would not consider that to be a case where the 14-day would apply from the point at which the student ceased attendance. There's no way for you to have any attendance taking during the period when the student was on the break. So we consider that an exceptional
And
circumstance.
supposing they don't come for 2 or 3 days before the break starts, is that a different scenario?
So in that case, we would expect you to consider those days, and it's a much more gray area type of question that, frankly, I can't give you a solid answer on because we've never expressed any position on that from the department's perspective. If I was an auditor, I might say that you weren't in compliance on that one because you should have checked at the time at the end of the break to make sure the student was going to come back and then withdrew them if you determined that they weren't. But unfortunately, I can't give you a specific answer about that particular case. If the student attends right up until the break, then it is a clear situation in our view because you have no reason to believe that they've withdrawn. If they were not in attendance for a few days, maybe. If they weren't in attendance for like a whole week, then it starts to become clearer and clearer that that's not an exceptional circumstance that we would allow for. But unfortunately, I can't give you a specific answer on that. I would recommend in any of those cases to just check in with the student and withdraw as soon as possible. But it is, because it's a gray area, I would say the other thing is the department would have a hard time enforcing that on you, given the fact that there were only a few days prior to the break that the student was in attendance.
Okay.
So I'm sorry I can't be more helpful about
That's
that
okay.
one.
Just one other clarification, maybe. Did I misunderstand your answer in the first question? Do you remember what the first question was? That was the gal that had the loan money come in after the student's last date of attendance,
Yes.
but technically they were still enrolled.
Right.
Did you say they could keep some loan money?
Only if the calculation results in a post-withdrawal disbursement of the loan money. This is one of the only circumstances where you don't have to contact the student to tell them about a loan disbursement that is part of a post-withdrawal disbursement, because you've already dispersed the money.
Really?
So the reason that I try to characterize it this way, when you have an inadvertent overpayment, so number one, the department does expect you to try to limit those as much as possible. So if we see that you're doing this all the time, then there's going to be a different issue that we'll be concerned about. But if it happens once or twice, and that probably happens at almost all institutions every so often, then it's a specific situation where, yes, you've dispersed the money, so it's on the student's account. You've gone through the whole process to make sure that they've gotten their money, but you can't actually consider it to be aid dispersed in the calculation. So essentially, it'll show up in the calculation as aid that could have been dispersed, and the calculation may or may not show you a post-withdrawal disbursement of those loan funds. If it doesn't, if there's just a return of some grant funds or something else, then there's nothing else you do. The student's not eligible for the loan. You'd have to return the entire dollar amount. If the calculation shows you that there's a post-withdrawal disbursement of that loan that could have been dispersed during that period, then you'll have to figure out the difference between the amount of the post-withdrawal disbursement and the amount that you actually ended up dispersing, and reduce the loan by that amount. So that's how the department expects you to handle those situations. Because once you've made the disbursement, we don't expect you to necessarily take a bunch of steps to return all the money, then ask the student, do they want the post-withdrawal disbursement, then give them the disbursement and go through all of those processes. We're trying to make it a little simpler for you.
That is awesome. Is it in writing anywhere? I'm a third-party servicer,
Okay.
so our position has always been that all of it's post-withdrawal, and they have to have permission.
Yeah, so we haven't said that anywhere probably in the handbook, but if you want to send me an email, then
I certainly will.
I'd be
Thank
happy
you very
to.
much.
We can talk it through with you. Yep. I think over number 1.
Hi. I was just wondering if a class is counting toward a program of study, so it would count for aid, but the student is taking it for 0 credit, would I include it in the calendar if, say, some or all of the other classes they're taking have a spring break, for example, but that class is online and wouldn't be considered to have one?
Wow. So you gave me a unique question that I've never gotten before today, so thank you. If it's 0 credits, generally we don't consider it a Title IV eligible class. So it's not counting towards the student's eligibility, so you would generally just disregard that class as far as the RTT4 calculation goes.
So even though our system says, yes, it counts, because it's 0 credit, I wouldn't have to worry about it when I do their calc?
That's correct.
Okay, thank you.
Yep. Yes.
Hello. I actually have a question similar to the third-party servicer.
Okay.
About DOD.
Okay.
So we are a clock hour attendance taking.
Okay.
We have a student that has already notified us so we have a holiday break as well.
Okay. Yep.
But since we're clock hour, a little bit different.
Yep.
He is going to be on his break for an additional 4 days after the break officially ends.
Okay.
So he was asking whether he should take a leave of absence throughout the entire break plus those 4 days, or if he would just be counted absent.
Honestly, I think that one would be up to you, because if he ultimately doesn't return, then you'll have to do that calculation pretty quick. And remember that, yes, we say that the date of determination has to be within 14 days of the last date of attendance in these cases, but often you may not find out until a little bit later, and that just means that your time frame for making the returns is a little bit less. So we wouldn't specify. I mean, if you go through in the full approved leave of absence process, you're welcome to do that, and that's safer, I would say, from an institutional perspective, and we wouldn't prevent you from doing that, but you're not required to do that.
Awesome. And I do have one more question about an unofficial withdrawal and a suspension.
Okay. So wait, now we're an unofficial withdrawal, still in the attendance taking environment?
Yes.
Okay.
So a student is suspended for X amount of days, and they have a day that they're supposed to return, right?
Okay.
They do not return that day, they come back the next day. Does it work the same way as a leave of absence, to where you had a day you were supposed to return, you did not, and so unfortunately you are withdrawn?
So in this situation, the student didn't return when expected. So they were on a suspension, but it wasn't a leave of absence?
Correct.
Okay, and the suspension was like a week? How many?
Call it 30 days.
30 days. Generally, if you suspend a student for that period of time, and so I have to go through all the processes for this. Generally, what we would say is that the student would have to give you written confirmation that he or she intends to return at the end of the 30 days.
Okay.
So once that happens, then you don't consider them a withdrawal, and they would still meet all of our requirements for coming back in an appropriate time frame. If they fail to come back at that point, and you never saw them again, that's a withdrawal, and you do the calculation based on the last date of attendance. If they don't come back on the exact day, but they come back on the next day, then you're not going to consider them a withdrawal, because ultimately what would happen, let me give you a different example. Let's say that same thing happened, except the student came back 4 weeks later and then re-enroll. So what you'd have to do is reinstate the student's Title IV-8 at that point, and then move him along through the period. So we don't expect you to do all of that work if he comes back the next day. Essentially, now that he's back, and you don't need to do the calculation. But we do expect you to start the process of starting to look at, getting ready to do the calculation as soon as the student doesn't return on the day that you expected him to. If they happen to happily come back, then you can stop that process.
So essentially, we could choose to waive the standard process of like a LOA withdrawal. Did not return from leave of absence. My director had questions about whether or not it is considered the same. Not returning from LOA, not returning from suspension.
It is similar. This is another one where I might want to have an offline conversation with you guys. It's similar, but in the context of the written confirmation of return, the day that they don't return I think it's treated essentially the same way. We do expect you to start the process of doing the calculation, but when they come back, you don't actually have to do the calculation at that point, because the student is just continuing through their payment period again.
Just document in the file, essentially.
Exactly. So that'll have impacts on how many scheduled hours we're accruing during all that time, et cetera, if they drop out later. But yeah, just document what happened, and you don't need to go through the whole return process at that point.
Perfect. Thank you.
Sure. Okay. Over here.
So I'm at a school that does not take attendance.
Okay.
We have a hardship withdrawal process where students work with our Office of Student Life to withdraw when something has happened.
Okay.
On this form, they list a last date of attendance. Typically, that's sometimes significantly earlier than the date the form is signed.
Yep.
Our registrar's office kind of backdates to the last date of attendance to figure out a refund.
Okay.
But for return to Title IV purposes, I'm kind of wondering what the appropriate date to use is, because they didn't actually begin the withdrawal process until the date the form was signed.
So it's a really good question. And really, you have, because you're not required to take attendance, you have a number of different options in terms of how you identify that student's withdrawal date. You can always use the last date of an academically related activity to base your withdrawal date on. So if you choose to, you can use that same date back when the last recorded date of academically related activity, but you don't have to. If the student drops out because of significant personal circumstance that was out of their control, you can use the date that roughly you determine as the institution when that occurred. So that could be a whole set of things that you decide based on your own institutional policies. You could also use the official withdrawal date, the date that the student communicated that he or she was intending to withdraw. Either of those would be acceptable. So it's up to you, really, in that circumstance, which one you want to work with. Okay. And this is one where I don't often point to the regulations, but if you're worried about that, go to 668.8, 668.22c. and look down through the different options for how an institution that's not required to take attendance can determine a withdrawal date. That will give you all of the different options, and this is one of those cases where several options will apply for you because it was a circumstance out of the student's control, it sounds like, or you can use the date that they informed you or the last date of academically related activity, and you'll see that all of those are options.
Thank you.
Sure. I think this one? Yeah, number 3. I think you were first.
So if a student is administratively withdrawn and has received grades, do we still have to do an R2T4?
So you mean administratively withdrawn essentially after they've already completed the term?
Yeah, okay, so we have a nursing program.
Okay.
It's kind of treated like modules. So they'll start like clinicals or something like that, and they'll receive grades, but they haven't finished that program. And so they'll get W's in the rest of it for that semester, but say they've received 1 C because they've completed so many hours, but then they're administratively withdrawn. Is an R2T4 required?
Wow. So this one might be, unfortunately, another one where I have to talk to you, but clinical periods get really complicated with how R2T4 works because clinical periods often don't fit into your regular term dates. They extend before or after. However, whichever term that you're including the clinical time frame in, we're expecting you to include the clinical period as part of the days in the denominator of the calculation. So, and that could be a module within a larger set of modules. So really, it's about the same thing that I said earlier about modules. On the date that the student ceased attendance, and maybe that was the day that they completed something and got a passing grade, was the student still scheduled to attend other classes in the same period? If so, they were withdrawal.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right, thank you.
Sure. Number 1?
So my question is similar to, we have a form with the withdrawal date where the dean of students will put the last day of attendance on there.
Yep.
But we sometimes won't get it for 2-3 weeks because it goes through
Right.
IT, housing, all this other stuff. Because it's on our official form for the date of determination, is it when the registrar gets the form, or is it when the student affairs official determined it, they were withdrawn as of a certain date?
And this is an official withdrawal. They're filling out the form to officially withdraw. Generally, it's the date that your institution has a withdrawal process. You've set that out in your policies.
Yes.
Generally, it's the date that the student begins that process that is both the official withdrawal date and the date of determination. So we understand that it does take time for that process to sort of play itself out, but that's part of why the 45-day period exists, to give you guys time to get that return done after that.
Now, would it be permissible to write in our policies that the form starts and the dean of students can put the withdrawal date, but the only office that can determine you're officially withdrawn is the registrar? And then use the registrar's determination you have actually withdrawn as the date of determination, as long as it's in our policy?
That's a tough one because the regulations generally say that it's the date that the student begins the process. Maybe you could argue that somehow the process hasn't begun until the registrar signs off on it, but that sounds like a hard sell. I'm not sure that you could get that far. I would say generally the safest course of action is to just consider that when the student signs the form in the first place, that's when your official withdrawal date is, and that's when your date of determination is.
Okay. And then I had another question about unofficial withdrawals.
Okay.
So I know if a student gets all Fs at the end of a term on their transcript, you have to look and see when their last date of academically related activity is. Our registrar's office decides that after the 60% date of the term, if you want to withdraw, they'll withdraw you but give you all Fs. Which I'm kind of saying you're contradicting yourself on that. But they'll mark them in our system as withdrawn, but the transcript will show all Fs. So they'd really fall into 2 categories.
So when you say F, do you differentiate between an earned F and an unearned F?
They do not.
Okay, so if they
they
get
will
all
give an
Fs, they're
and
withdrawal.
it'll affect the GPA for the cumulative GPA and everything, but they will be withdrawn.
Okay. I'm not sure it would have any impact for federal purposes. It doesn't sound like a great practice to me.
Yeah, I'm trying to get
But as long as you're still performing the withdrawal calculation, you're determining the student's withdrawal date appropriately and doing all of those things, how it shows up on the transcript isn't necessarily an issue. Again, if the F is equivalent to a W, because I can imagine cases where an F, if they consider an earned F to be F, that would be a huge problem for us because those would show up as completers. But and in this case, I can't see any federal impact.
So the question, the reason why I'm asking the question is our auditors will ask for, give us everyone who got all Fs and give us everyone who withdrew, and they'll be on 2 different reports, and they go, why are they on 2 different reports?
Got it. I think that's probably an internal control issue that you want to talk through. The auditor really is looking, because really the all Fs person is a withdrawal just like the other student.
Right.
And unless you can just show that the student completed one of those classes by some other means, then they're still a withdrawal. So that the auditor ought to be taking both the withdrawals and the all F students and putting them in the same report when looking at the return of Title IV process. But yeah, for you guys, it probably would make sense to either find a way to flag those students as also withdrawn for your auditing purposes, or something else to kind of show that they're equivalent in the sense of your compliance with Title IV regulations. Yeah.
Thank you.
Sure.
Hi. I actually challenge what you're saying a little bit about determining date of determination, because I've asked this question 2 conferences in a row now. Students may begin a process but then not actually stop attending classes, or they may express interest in it, and this is where at our institution we have a really small number of our 2 T4s just because of the nature of the population, and it is not easy to figure out exactly what date of determination is versus last day of attendance for us, because there's such an extensive counseling process, particularly for undergrads.
Between the 2.
So we may have students, undergraduates, who have gone through this extensive counseling process, they are still attending classes, and then ultimately the advising group will say, oh, we're going to backdate their last day of attendance to, they're going to call it at October 25th or October 1st, and then process the paperwork and notify the administration that on November 15th that happened. So in those cases, it seems appropriate to me to use the day they've made that decision as their date of determination, because they're backing it up so far for other reasons. Their goal is to make sure that the student is academically whole or academically protected, because it's a highly selective group of students.
Right.
They're academic, they're highly accomplished, and they don't want the students to be traumatized in some way, or try and get out of leaving the program by saying, oh, well, financially we can't take your advice, we're not going to withdraw, that kind of thing. So we're trying our best to do our due diligence, but due to the nature of the situation, date of determination is often very different.
Yeah, I can certainly see the issue, and I've heard similar questions from schools. So there's a couple of different considerations that I would say. One of them is that if the student is still attending during this period, so let's say that they've come to an office and they've expressed an interest in withdrawing, but they keep going to class for another few weeks during that time frame, and then they ultimately do decide to drop out finally, and they also get the paperwork done at that time, then you can still use the last date of attendance as the withdrawal date, and then your date of determination doesn't need to be any earlier than the withdrawal date. But I do understand your concern, and maybe you can send me an email about this one too, and we can look at it together. There's only a few exceptions to the official withdrawal date is the same as the date of determination requirement, but we can look at it. I'd be glad to see if there's anything in the regulations that we can do to give you that flexibility.
Because I've talked to other compliance folks about this issue, and I don't have knowledge of it
Right. You don't know that you don't know that they've withdrawn until much later.
Right, and it's not in
yeah.
our system. The effective date in the system and the audit trail in the system isn't until much later, so it's almost impossible.
Yep. So I will just say, as a general rule, we treat the institution's knowledge of this as the knowledge of the students, initiating the withdrawal process. But like I said, I also acknowledge that there are occasions where there is a long time frame between that expression of intent and when the financial aid office gets a hold of it. So what I want to say is, again, as a general rule, we state that the date of determination is synonymous with the official withdrawal date. But like I said, I'd be glad to look at it with you and see if there's anything, and maybe I can look at what your compliance folks said, because I'm not seeing something about the situation.
No, I am the compliance person. I've talked to my peers about
I
this
gotcha.
issue.
Okay.
So
Yep.
yeah, it's like, strikes fear in my heart, basically.
Yeah, no, but this is a bit of an issue that comes up from time to time, and especially at large institutions that don't have many withdrawals, this is something that we do hear quite often, is that, look, we've got a 3-week process where they have to go to each of their different professors and each of these different offices and all of these kinds of things. So the department's rules haven't changed on this for some time, but like I said, I can take a look, and it may be something that I can consider escalating if it's something that seems like it's going to be an issue for a lot of schools.
Okay, thank you.
Sure. I'm not sure which one over here. Number 3.
So we know that on modules that if a student withdraws after the first module ends, but before the second one begins, it's treated as an R2T4, correct?
Correct.
Did you allude to that there's changes coming in that?
So there's going to be, so during the negotiated rulemaking process that ended in April of 2019, the department agreed with negotiators to make a number of fairly small but important changes to the return of Title IV rules, keeping in mind that none of this is applicable now. This has not even been published in an NPRM, but the agreement was, in certain cases, if a student completes more than a module or modules that constitute more than half of a payment period, then they're not considered withdrawn under any circumstances. And if they complete at least half-time coursework, so let's say 6 credits out of 12 in any module, then they're not considered withdrawn. So those would be the exceptions to the general withdrawal rule. But there will be occasions where this whole process still has to play out. It won't be the proposed changes to the regs won't remove all of those cases, but we hope that it removes many.
Thank you.
Sure. Number 1.
Hi, thank you for the PWD post-withdrawal disbursement after the LDA disbursement. So thank you for that. My scenario, say for example, start date is 9/30/2019. LDA is 10/2/2019. It's considered a cancel. Loans were originated before the LDA date of 10/2.
Okay.
Is there a regulation to complete the R2T4 in that scenario?
All right, you have to go through it for me one more time. So what kind of program, first of all? Standard term, non-standard term?
Standard.
A standard
Just
term?
a regular 8-week program.
Okay. And go one more time.
Okay. Start date is 9/30.
Okay.
September 30th. LDA is 10/2.
Okay.
Loans were originated, and no Pell.
Yep.
Originated, say, 9/30.
Yep.
So it's before the LDA.
Yep.
It's a cancel.
So did they ever attend? Was there any attendance in the period?
Yes, but tuition is not posted until 7 days after, which will be 10/8.
Yeah. So that is a return of Title IV situation. And so what you'll have to do is perform the calculation. The loans will be included as aid that could have been dispersed, again, assuming that all the other conditions are met. And then you'll have to offer a very small amount of the post-withdrawal disbursement to the student.
Yeah.
And again, if this is a first disbursement of a direct loan, which
And at
I'm
least
assuming it
half-time.
is. Yeah. So yes, unfortunately, I know that it's a lot of work to go through that process in this situation, but it would be a return of Title IV, and you would have to follow the process to its completion.
Even if it's a cancel.
Well, the real differentiating factor is that the student attended. The moment the student attends even one day in the payment period, then it becomes a return of Title IV situation as opposed to what the department calls a 668.21 situation where they never attended. If they've never attended, generally all of their aid will go back, except maybe a portion that went to them that went to the student as a credit balance from their loan. But if they attend even one day in the payment period, then the school has to use the return of Title IV process and follow it whatever it requires.
Okay, thank you. I do want to exchange contact information.
Sure, no problem.
Thank you.
Yeah. Number 3?
Hi, my question is very similar to hers.
Okay.
We had a student, we're a non-attendance taking university.
Okay.
She began her very first term with us.
Okay.
She answered roll call, was academically engaged for 13 days.
Okay.
Experienced a tragedy. The university decided to back off her charges.
Okay.
And also drop her courses. So if you were to look in our system, she is a cancel.
Mm-hmm.
But
Yeah.
she was enrolled and attending.
Yep.
Do I do an R2T4?
Yes.
Okay.
So in those situations, even though you've backed off all the tuition, it doesn't change the fact that the student was eligible for the aid and began attendance during the period. And those are the factors that the department considers when we look at whether a calculation is needed.
Thank you.
Sure.
That's what I did, and then I started second guessing myself. So I emailed Ask a
Yep.
Fed, and she said, if you back charges off, then the student's not eligible for anything.
And that's not true.
Okay.
Yeah.
I didn't think so.
Yeah. So it's a reasonable thing to think. I understand why some schools believe that that's the case, and we've had other situations where the student requests a medical withdrawal in the next term, and they back off charges from a prior term, and they also back off all the student's aid. You can't do that either. You have to look at you have to do a return of Title IV calculation in those situations and see what the student might have been eligible for. So in some ways it's counterintuitive because the student is receiving aid for something where they didn't get charged, but that the department doesn't consider that facet. Remember, your charges are completely outside the R2T4 process, so it's not something that we consider.
So her LDA was on a Tuesday. Her loans were dispersed on that Friday. So the R2T4 should have been completed as the post-withdrawal disbursement.
That would have been aid that could have been dispersed, right?
Yes.
Yep.
Okay, thank you.
Sure. Number 3?
Well, ironically, that question was pretty much my
Oh,
question.
okay.
But I just want to follow up because as far as like an administrative withdrawal, so we will occasionally get into those situations where we have to drop a student. All of their all of their charges are gone, registration's gone.
Okay.
So I know that we have to do an R2T4, and so we would use the date, I guess, that they're administratively withdrawn. But sometimes determining that date is a little bit confusing unless, and so the other part of that is the documentation that we have to prove that they actually attended. So we do have an audit trail in our system, like when it was dropped and added, but do I need to take it one step further and get documentations from the professors or something to say how far he actually attended?
Well, what you definitely, I think there's 2 layers to it. The first layer is you definitely need to get a confirmation that the student attended at least one day in one of the classes. If you can't, then it's a little easier for you, in fact, because then that's a non-attender, and there won't be an R2T4 process. You'll just return all of the aid and follow the requirements in 668.21. If the student did attend, then if you're not attendance taking, you're not required to use the last day of an academically related activity. You can use the date that you administratively withdrew the student, but you can use the LDA if you want to. So you can go back and determine how far the student got in order to determine the exact amount the student was eligible for.
Right, so we don't take attendance, so I could just use that withdrawn date.
Yes, that's right.
withdrawn.
So we have some rules that are set out in the handbook about cases where you administratively withdraw someone as a result of non-attendance. So I'm not sure if this is that case, but in those cases, just to be really clear with everybody, you can't use a late administrative withdrawal to essentially extend a student's attendance. You can't do that. But if your administrative withdrawal is for some other reason, that's essentially an official withdrawal date. And so it's the official withdrawal date and it's the date of determination all on the same day.
But it makes sense to reach out to the professors and say, did he attend?
So
Most of the time we assume he attended. There's no reason to believe he's not, but we don't have it in writing.
You have to have it documented.
Right.
So you always have to document the one day of attendance in order to show that they're eligible for any aid whatsoever. And it's important for you guys because an auditor, if they're really paying attention to that, will say, well, why didn't you return everything? You don't know that their student attended.
Right.
So you'll have to be able to show yes or no. And if you can't come up with anything, then you can't come up with anything, and all the aid has to go back. But you do need to do that. I would say an important internal control is to do that check.
Got it. Thank you.
Sure. Number 3. Okay. I think we have time for maybe one more, unfortunately. Sorry about that, everybody.
So I had a student who did a total withdrawal, and then, so she never got any funds because she didn't finish verification, so I didn't do a return to Title IV. But then she came back and finished verification, and so now I have to do a post-withdrawal disbursement return to Title IV.
So I want to, these are always complicated, so I want to make sure I get the facts right.
Mm-hmm.
So in this case, the student was attending, they were eligible, except that they hadn't completed verification.
Yes.
So were they eligible for non-need-based aid?
Yeah, they were eligible for Pell and loans.
Okay, so what generally should happen is when a student drops out in that circumstance, you haven't completed verification, you haven't done interim disbursements of aid yet, you do the calculation based on if it's starting to get close to the deadline, for example, so starting to get to the 30-day point, you have to do the calculation based on the non-need-based aid, because that's all you know the student was eligible for at that point. And then you may end up, it may find a post-withdrawal disbursement is available. You'd still have to offer that to the student during the right time frame, all of that sort of thing. And then, if the student does get verification completed, then you need to do a new calculation that incorporates all of the aid the student could have been dispersed during the period as of that point. So that could include your subsidized loan, could include your, if it was originated, and it will include a Pell Grant, all that kind of thing. And then you would have to either give a post-withdrawal disbursement of grant funds, or depending on the situation, offer the loan funds.
So I did the R2T4 now after she did verification and post-withdrawal. So I should have done a first one, even though she wasn't complete with financial aid with the verification side of things?
So it really comes down to, do you expect the student to complete the verification in time for you to do the R2T4 calculation? Because the deadline for that is a hard deadline. We don't give you any outs for that. And the deadline for that is you have to do the calculation and include all the aid that the student was eligible for at that moment. And in your student's case, that would be just non-need-based aid. So that's why we tell schools to do it that way. Now, if you know the student is pretty close to getting it done, you can try to delay your calculation for as long as possible until hoping that they get the verification done before the deadline. But if that doesn't happen, you still have to do your calculation, and you still have to include any aid that the student was eligible for. So in these cases, it's kind of an administrative hassle, because you don't want to have to do 2 calculations in like a 2-week span and offer 2 different amounts of loan. That's just going to confuse the student. But sometimes it does happen that way. So it's in those cases, yeah, you have to do the calculation based on the non-need-based aid the student was eligible for. And then if the student eventually completes verification within your deadlines, it has to, if it happens after your verification deadlines, then you don't have to do anything with it. But if they do their verification within your verification deadline, then yes, you'll have to redo the calculation and make whatever offers are applicable based on what the calculation says.
Okay, thank you.
Sure. Right. So I think that's all the time that we have. Now, I'm going to let one more question since you were waiting all this time. But if anyone needs to go to your next session, please feel free. But thank you so much for your attendance. I had a lot of great questions, and I really appreciate you spending your lunch hour with me. Thank you.
Thanks for taking my question.
Sure.
It's probably a simple question. It's more about conditions for late disbursement.
Okay.
We are a typical semester school, credit hour. We always opt to go for last date of attendance at an academically related activity.
Mm-hmm.
Student last date of attendance is on a Monday.
Okay.
They complete their financial aid paperwork, and we originate their loans on Wednesday.
Okay.
We have the plan in place to prevent an inadvertent overpayment. Did not disperse. Official withdrawal comes through on Friday of the same week.
Okay.
Is that student eligible for post-withdrawal disbursement.
So you originated the loan?
Yes.
And did the student sign the master promissory note?
Yes.
Is this the first disbursement of a direct loan?
Yes.
Then it sounds like the student meets all of the criteria for including that loan in the calculation as aid that could have been dispersed, and then you'll make an offer to the student of the amount the student may be eligible for.
That's even though it was originated after the last date of attendance, which is what we're using as the withdrawal date.
So I missed that date. Yeah, so if the origination happened after the last date of attendance, whatever you use as your withdrawal date is the date that is sort of the cutoff date for whether the student is eligible for the late disbursement. Once he's withdrawn, he's no longer considered enrolled, and you can't originate a loan after the student is no longer enrolled. So you're right that in that case, the student's not going to be eligible for anything, and you wouldn't even have to do a calculation if there's no other aid involved.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. And thanks again, everybody.